G'day everybody, I've got George Dvorsky here with me today. George Dvorsky's been a fixture in the transhuman scene and the futurist scene for quite some time now. The Sentient Development blogs has been around for a long time, and now George is also contributing editor at IO9, a very popular website on the internet that covers all sorts of weird and wonderful facts about science, technology, and popular stuff. So yes, we're going to be covering the Turing test and some recent news about it. So over to you, George. You wrote a very interesting article very quickly about the recent passing of the Turing test.
Yeah, I'll tell you quickly how that came about. On Sunday, this past Sunday, the news broke that that the Turing test had in fact been passed or beaten, however you want to put it, and that we're now, according to Kevin Warwick and colleagues, we're now in the age of artificial intelligence and so on. And of course, a lot of media jumped all over it, and at IO9 we had to address it very quickly as well. The news cycle being what it is.
Yeah.
So along with my colleague Robert Gonzalez, together we pieced together our review of it. We rather than title it, a computer has passed the Turing test for the first time, or that a computer is now a super intelligent, or rather a super intelligence now exists, and so on, we were very, very careful in our wording. What we said was that a chatbot had actually passed, and we kind of put "passed" in scare quotes, saying that it had passed the Turing test for the first time. And as we were putting it together on the Sunday night, I realized that we really just quickly had to get the news out, and that I wanted to spend the next day kind of taking it apart a little bit and delving a bit further and basically providing a kind of an exposition as to why the Turing test is pretty much, it's useless. So the next day, my feature for IO9 was an article that I entitled "Why the Turing Test is Bullshit," and it was one of the more, from what I saw, one of the more forcefully worded critiques of not just the announcement made by Kevin Warwick and the other the Russian developers. It was definitely also a critique that looked into the problems inherent in the Turing test itself, because I think ultimately the test is what's the problem here, I've kind of put together this piece on that.
Excellent. Yes. So look, there definitely is some flaws in the way that test is put together. Now, Alan Turing wasn't very specific about what the Turing test was in his early paper, and people seem to have gotten confused about predictions of how many people will pass an imitation game by 2000, and whether that was actually meant to be the part of the Turing test, and that being the 30% threshold, or 70%. Yeah. So that.
It was definitely the parameters that he set up were definitely vague. And the one big question, if you will, that you kind of pull out of what he did put together was the big issue that he wanted to solve was, can machines think? And via the Turing test, or what we now call the Turing test, he thought that this little conversation test could be perhaps a way of making the determination as to whether or not machines think. And I think that it's largely kind of taken on a life of its own, and different people have looked at it and interpreted it differently and are applying it obviously now very differently. But I think it's important to kind of take a couple of steps back and get to the very root, or the very essence, as to what Alan Turing was trying to get at, which was to ask the question, can machines think? And if so, how can we actually determine that? And I think that some 60 years ago, it was very reasonable, I think, to assume that you could probably do it by trying to look at the sophistication of conversations and realize that, wow, what could be more advanced, or what more sophisticated or more difficult to make a machine do than actually have a conversation with a human. And like I said, very reasonable assumption to make. Of course, back then he had no idea that his idea would be kind of perverted by, and even taken kind of along this weird tangent by having chatbots really become the main focus of Turing test studies, which is astounding to me because as I'm sure many of your guests have already pointed out, chatbots are anything but intelligent, at least not in the sense that, or in the way that Alan Turing was surmising. What's actually happened here is a kind of arms race amongst chatbot developers to see which one can trick which human the fastest. As I'm sure many people have pointed out, as a result, it's, well, one, it's obviously an arms race between chatbot developers, but secondly, it's also shown that in consideration of the Turing test being set up the way it has, it's actually been more a test of human gullibility and more a test of our ability to kind of parse out or determine what is it or who is it exactly that we're speaking to. I mean, those are just two, weaknesses right there. We can certainly get into many, many more over the course of our conversation.
Yeah, that's right. And it seems as though there's a difference between how an AI developer who has an understanding of the complexities involved in developing artificial intelligence will react to such a thing, and the general populace who doesn't really know what's going on, who has more of a black box view of what's going on. And so when they see this sort of news article saying, you know, the AI has passed the Turing test and that means that we're in a golden age of artificial intelligence, the sort of things that are popping up in their minds are probably very different from what somebody like you or I or Ben Goertzel would be thinking. But it's a little bit misleading, because I don't think Alan Turing had in mind an arms race of semi-sophisticated but in no way cognitively sophisticated chatbots trying to optimize exploiting gullibilities in Turing test panelists.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it is very misleading, and it's very unfair of Kevin Warwick and company to make that claim, because, as you said, the public's understanding of a lot of this is very unsophisticated. They take, you know, a lot of what the media says, even a lot of what you know, these so-called, you know, developers and professors say at face value. And when you see headlines that say, you know, we have an artificial intelligence now that has passed the Turing test, or even the wording was even more like we have a supercomputer that's passed the test. No, it was not a computer, it was not a supercomputer, it's not even arguably an AI, although I would argue that there's obviously some components of artificial intelligence in a chatbot. Let's not be completely unfair. But that you have to be kind of very careful when you present this material and this information to the public, because there's also, it can be quite frightening. I did see some, you know, reactions that were like, oh my God, you know, we're now headed toward the singularity, or the AI apocalypse is upon us in short order, and so on. So you can get some, maybe, I wouldn't say there was mass hysteria produced by this announcement, but certainly you had some people, you know, maybe making much more of it than it really was.
And I imagine there could have been a little bit more hysteria if people like you didn't step in and try and set things straight, and actually try and convey what was really going on, and talk about the unsophisticated nature of the chatbot and what it was really doing. It wasn't, you know, some sort of uber brain that was ready to take over the internet.
Yeah, and we weren't the only outlet. You know, Wired had one today, actually, a bit late to the show, but they had one today or yesterday. Right. And the New Yorker had one, which was very good. And and New Scientist, pretty much on day one or day two, also had a very critical view of it as well. So I guess it matters. You know, it kind of also matters who you pick to where you choose to read your information on these sorts of things.
Yeah, that's true. But the ones who are like very quick to quick at the whip, got out and said some pretty, I guess, So some of the early articles seem to be very in favor of the fact that we've entered a new age of artificial intelligence, which on other fronts we probably have, and that's the point. But this is not a very good symbol of it. It's not really emblematic of the fact that we've reached we've made progress in AI, because the chatbot behind the scenes isn't a good example of that, to my understanding.
Well, very well said. And it's a distraction. And like I said, it might give too much emphasis on the development of chatbots when it comes to developing AI. So people might think, well, this is where we have to focus our time and energy and resources, or into the conversation engines, natural language processing, which, I mean, obviously natural language processing is very important. IBM's Watson is a very good example of the powers that can come from, you know, that line of development. Mind you, Watson is much more than just a silly chatbot. It's also an information. It also pulls in information, can source information. It does incredible probability analyses to determine right from wrong answers, or at least make a best guess as to what's the right and wrong answer. And you can actually converse with it. You can actually ask it a question in plain English. It can understand grammar. And even what was even amazing about the whole Jeopardy aspect of it was you could even ask it a question in the form of a question, or sorry, the format of Jeopardy is you give it an answer and it has to come back to you in the form of a question. That's even more sophisticated. So that's, you know, if you're gonna be talking about, like I said, natural language processing and human conversation and all that, look more toward IBM and Watson and what they're doing there, rather than, let's say, Cleverbot and you know, Eliza and other things like that. As interesting and as fun as they might be, for example.
As fun as they might be, yeah, that's right. But you know, I also saw a number of people getting quite excited about this amongst the futurist crowd, because it kind of validates the belief that AI is coming, and it sort of rings true in a sense if you don't really look at it very skeptically. And you know, it's something that people will easily share if it's a nice story that sort of confirms one's position that AI is something that we should think about. But yeah, as far as I understand, you know, having a Turing test being bitten by a linguistically challenged chatbot, modeled on a linguistically challenged human who's 13 years old and who's a Ukrainian young boy who has English as a second language, it's sort of even, it's so even on the surface, it's kind of like cheating a little bit, it feels like.
It was definitely cheating. I think that was the first thing that occurred to me, and a lot of people called them out on that as well, is that was not, you know, a fair approximation, if you will, of, let's say, a full-blown human, but they would maybe argue that, hey, it's all's fair in, you know, love and Turing tests. So just as a quick aside, as it occurred to me, Ray Kurzweil also had a post that he put out, I think, yesterday, where he actually kind of defended the Turing test a little bit. Where, you know, because my perspective was that the Turing test is pretty much useless, and we need to kind of think about something different. Again, don't get me wrong. Like, I think we need a test. Like, it's actually very important that we can start to not just measure but identify intelligence as it emerges in our machines. Even more crucially, I think there's the peripheral issue is when can we start to identify when self-awareness starts to emerge in these machines? And I'd like to get back to that in just a second before I lose my train of thought here. But I think that, and not that I want to maybe speak for Kurzweil, and maybe I'm misrepresenting him, but I think he was saying that we can revive the Turing test so long as we do honor the parameters of it, and that we have the right approach to it, have the right judges, have the right, you know, attitude in terms of the developers to try to make it work. But again, I really think that this is the wrong track. I think trying to determine intelligence and self-awareness through conversations is kind of a lost cause. Now, one idea that occurred to me, or one thought, is like, let's take a bonobo, grade 8, for example, would absolutely spectacularly fail the Turing test. Yet no one would deny that they don't exhibit an extraordinary level of intelligence. Lots of different kinds of intelligence, problem-solving skills, you know, a sense of self, a sense of future, a sense of past, a sense of empathy, theories of other mind. Amazing, but they would they would spectacularly fail the Turing test. So what does that tell you? It tells you that's not the right approach. Similarly, we can have machines that are going to be unbelievably powerful and sophisticated. They're going to be able to conduct a number of tasks and perform, produce results for us and so on. And it'll be obvious to us, without even having a conversation with it, that it did something pretty remarkable, that it did something that required a hell of a whole lot of intelligence. Yet we're not going to deny it, therefore, that it's not intelligent, because it actually produced these results for us. So I think in other ways, it's going to be absolutely blatantly obvious that our machines are exhibiting greater than human levels of intelligence when it comes to certain tasks. Like, we already have computers today that are performing or figuring out, you know, math equations, for example, and mathematical problems that we couldn't possibly do on our own on a chalkboard. You know, factoring, you know, the primes up to like the billions of digits and so on. That seems pretty super intelligent to me. Obviously, we're talking very narrow band of intelligence. But again, this is maybe a problem inherent to the Turing test, is it's measuring an extremely narrow area of intelligence, in this case, human-level conversation. But even that's missing the point, because conversation is clearly easy to simulate. Conversation is very easy to simulate, but not necessarily very easy to emulate, because the kind of conversation that I think Alan Turing had in mind, or if he didn't, he should have had in mind, was, is there a self-aware agent is there a kind of agency behind that conversation? Are you actually speaking to a machine that's thinking, that's pondering the questions that you're asking it, and then giving you a thoughtful response, rather than being something that's script-driven, hitting the algorithms, doing the Boolean equations, and all those sorts of things? That's a different thing altogether. While I'm on this rant, one last thing, and when it does come to measuring consciousness and self-awareness, is that's a whole other kettle of fish, because we don't even know how to do that right now. We are all kind of living a kind of, we're all in denial, I suppose, of our solipsism right now. We pretty much go under the assumption that all of the humans around us and a lot of non-human animals around us are self-aware and that they exhibit consciousness. To not do so would be, like I said, solipsistic. And Adam, I take it for granted that you have a mind and that you're conscious. Yet I have no way, scientists have absolutely no way of having a test to prove that. And what we need to do is come up with that. Once we can come up with that, what are called finding the neural correlates of consciousness, the NCCs in our brain, those things that spark consciousness. Once we can do that, then we can say, Adam's actually, we can prove that he's conscious. See, take a look at that, and take a look at that, and take a look at that. Now, once we can actually translate those neural correlates of consciousness in machine form or in a digital, kind of a digital version of it, we should be able to likewise point out what those digital neural correlates of consciousness are in the machine. So we can say, it's sparking up like that, that, and that. Therefore, we kind of have to, not only that, it's also passing, let's say, other criteria in terms of our sense of self-awareness. And then and only then can we actually satisfactorily say that, yes, we're dealing with a machine here that is self-aware. And by the way, there is still an open question as to whether or not we can code a machine through ones and zeros to actually make it self-aware. A lot of, I'm sure this is where me and a lot of futurists and thinkers diverge. Is I think like I said, the jury's still out on whether or not we can make a non-material, non-biological entity, if you will, produce the kind of conscious awareness that animals do. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I'm saying that still, I think the burden of proof still lies on both the whole brain emulators and the algorithm-driven AI developers as well.
Sure, yes. And I think Alan Turing had some thoughts about, any pattern could be represented in a Turing machine. I'm not sure whether that includes quantum stuff, but yeah, a quantum universal Turing machine, it has been hypothesized, would be able to achieve any pattern. And that, if consciousness comes down to patterns and is not something else, then I imagine that a Turing machine could do that. But whether we'll be able to encode that in ones and zeros alone, whether we can do that in von Neumann architecture alone, whether we need quantum computers or something else, then that's an open question. I suspect that perhaps we may be able to achieve something, close or functionally equivalent to human consciousness in von Neumann architecture. But that's an intuition because I don't know all the details.
Right. I'm a little bit skeptical about the von Neumann architecture, but like yourself, I don't know. I mean, the only time will tell. I do like the idea of this so-called quantum Turing machine. It sounds very intriguing. That we've still got obviously ways to go before we can actually get to something like that. But that also assumes as well, and maybe I'm assuming incorrectly, that it also assumes that there's a quantum aspect to consciousness which hasn't been proven yet. We still need to tap into, obviously there's others do believe in the kind of, that there is a kind of essence to consciousness that's embedded in the laws of the universe that you can't necessarily transfer over into, let's say, any kind of a Turing machine at all, which would kind of throw the, I guess, the Church-Turing hypothesis out the window to a certain degree, and the functionalist or computational hypothesis out the window. I think that it's probably a combination of the two. I think you probably can't have a conscious awareness without the kind of computational, the kind of cognitive aspects to it. I think these things it's a hybrid system. I think that I think eventually we probably will be able to emulate a brain. And it's going to be a really strange-looking jalopy that'll probably have physical components and digital components, but it may actually work at some point.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there has been hypotheses about how the mind works and consciousness works that have quantum theory at the heart of it, but I don't doubt that there's some form of quantum noise affecting, you know, the overall output of how the brain works. And I think, you know, if the brain did evolve in an environment where quantum noise existed, it would probably take advantage of it somehow, like as some form of random coin flip, or I don't know, right? So yeah, I would be surprised if there was if the brain worked out how to filter out all the noise in its environment, including quantum noise, to be like a very sort of computational processing unit, much like, you know, there's all sorts of like algorithms that we have to filter out noise in a computational system that we build, right? You know, XORs and bit flips and things like that too.
Right.
Yeah, to try and filter out like mistakes, cyclic redundancy checks and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, and definitely this is one area that maybe has been neglected right now. It's like, well, I shouldn't say it's neglected. It's just that we don't even know where to start. The so-called hard problem of consciousness. So where do you start?
Well,
yeah,
you got to start at either one side of this explanatory gap or the other, or maybe even both. It seems as though, like with the progresses in neuroscience, this explanatory gap is closing. Whether it will never be fully closed, I don't know. It's a question for the philosophers to kick around.
I'm not. By the way, I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea that quantum effects might be involved. I mean, we've already proven, in fact, that biology does tap into quantum effects. We've learned, for example, that plants through photosynthesis actually use a quantum phenomenon to become more efficient at photosynthesis, which is actually quite amazing if you think about it. So perhaps, like you were saying, there's a reason for it in terms of the emergence of mind and this thing that is qualia and self-awareness, that there might actually be something to it. The problem when you invoke these kinds of answers, though, is it sounds a bit, you know, there's that woo factor to it. And like when in doubt, use quantum. You know, like, oh, I don't know why this does that, so I'll just say it must be quantum. And it's obviously really a lame, you know, way of escape hash that we have. But in this case, there actually might be something to it.
Yeah, it's unfortunate sometimes when you don't understand things, we often invoke this mysterious word to try and fill in the gaps so that it sounds like we have a concrete explanation where we don't. So,
yeah, unfortunately, yeah.
So it's interesting, like that there has been other attempts at trying to crack this Turing test idea. I think there was a paranoid schizophrenic chatbot that passed the Turing test previously as well. I think his name was Para. Did you hear about that?
I did not hear about that. That sounds definitely bizarre.
Yeah. Well, the fact is, it was again resting on the assumption that the person that the chatbot was trying to emulate or simulate was a linguistically challenged and maybe even perhaps mentally challenged person. So yeah, it's not really trying to emulate a fully functional, healthy adult here. Yeah. So so this Eugene Goosman phenomenon, do you think there's anybody who's out there thinking that Eugene Goosman is really an AI sort of lurking in the dark corners of the internet, listening into our conversations and plotting its day of reckoning?
That's impossible for me to know. I certainly hope not. I think we've done our part at IO9 to get the word out that this is not the case. And you know, you bring an interesting question though, is like, you know, when might that happen? And it's very difficult to kind of put the timelines on these sorts of things. But boy, doesn't it seem, you know, when you see headlines like this, even if they are sensationalistic and wildly inaccurate, though that is what we're seeing here is we're iteratively seeing our machines start to surpass us in virtually every category that humans had always thought that they were, you know, maybe special at, or was going to be unique, or, you know, somehow unique. I mean, when Kasparov lost to Deep Blue in the 1990s, we now learned that, well, chess isn't the pinnacle of human intelligence, and so on. I mean, we're constantly.
You mentioned Watson before too, yeah.
Watson,
examples.
yeah. But I mean, that's all fine and well because all of these are very narrow expert systems that's all that they're good at. You put Watson out into a rainstorm and it won't have the sense to put up an umbrella and get the hell out of there. It will just eventually short circuit and drown under the water. Whereas a human, we have problem solving skills, or what was referred to in computer science as a general intelligence. That's what we're trying to do, is develop an artificial general intelligence so that it has all of the various skills that we have that make us human. That's maybe perhaps that could be a kind of a Turing test, is to be this extremely broad battery of tests and measures to determine, just how much, or determine the capability of machines over a broad spectrum of challenges. And that would be more satisfactory, I think. But even then, what you're doing is just measuring brute intelligence. You're not necessarily measuring self-awareness. These are two very distinct things that the Turing test absolutely fails to address, and for that reason, it's wholly inadequate.
Right, and like I mentioned before, it's a black box approach. It's looking at the trying to observe the outputs and perhaps the inputs, and without actually looking inside and seeing what's going on to actually generate those. So that's interesting. I agree with you about the general intelligence aspect. I think this is a very important thing to watch. It may be very difficult to track the progress of such a thing, because how do we design a test that's good at tracking each different architecture of general intelligence that people come up with? What are we measuring, right? It's hard to know until everything works in a general intelligence, I think. And if you've got half a general intelligence, it's not really that general. And so it's going to be interesting trying to design the right sorts of tests or the right sorts of criteria to measure progress on such a subject.
And by the way, Adam, this is exactly the same problem that's kind of plaguing animal rights researchers right now and animal rights advocates, and which is really the issue of personhood. Is when do we measure or when can we actually determine whether an animal has this thing that's called personhood? And through the Rights of the Non-Human Persons program at the IEET, what we're trying to do is get this conversation started and trying to actually point at the specifics. Stephen Wise's group, which has a similar name, Rights of Non-Human Persons program, their approach is very practical. And they've got on board a science advisor by the name of Lori Marino, and what she does right now, her focus is on chimpanzees, and because that's who they picked to be their first, I guess, client, if you will, in terms of getting them designated as persons. And what they've done is they've absolutely, collected as much scientific information as they can. I actually saw the body of evidence that they presented to the judge. It was like a phone book sized book like this, full of cited studies, peer-reviewed in all the journals, and to show that, yes, in fact, that chimpanzees exhibit all of these criteria, bang, 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 and because they hit all the marks, we cannot deny them their personhood. And what I mean by personhood are the things that we were just describing earlier, sense of self. So, for example, to recognize oneself in the mirror, which is a fundamental test that dolphins can pass and elephants can pass and so on, but dogs cannot. But does that mean dogs have no sense of self? I kind of doubt that. It just means they don't understand the concept of a mirror, I suppose, but who knows? But there are other tests. For example, chimpanzees and all great apes have what's so-called theory of other mind. That means they know that somebody else has thoughts in their mind. But not only does another person have thoughts in their mind, but you can actually manipulate those thoughts. So I can trick you, I can lie to you, I can deceive you, I can hide things from you, because I know that through my actions I can change your state of mind. That's a very complex thing, and all the great apes can do it. And that which shows that there's something very sophisticated going on. And yet they don't have those verbal skills, the linguistic skills, in the way that we do to kind of articulate that. So we learn this through behavioral studies. And so, yeah, that's I guess the point I want to make by all this is that I like the approach by Stephen Wise and company, because they're actually providing some actual markers with which we can actually point to, in this case, chimpanzees, and say, yes, there's personhood there, which is really what Alan Turing was trying to ask back in the 1950s when it came to machines, is there a kind of a personhood there? Although back then it was more, can machines think? And again, at the risk of repeating ourselves, there's so many different things as to what thinking is that we have to kind of parse that down, come up with criteria. So, I've seen lists for personhood that contain things like a sense of self, the ability to project oneself into the future, to understand a sense of consequences for actions, to also have a sense of a past and a history, to understand that there's this kind of narrative flow that is your life. All these sorts of things. So if a machine can start to exhibit these things, I think we can prove that it actually is experiencing those things at a subjective level, then we have no choice but to respect the personhood of it, or in this case, to actually recognize that it's passed a kind of Turing test of sorts. Now, why that's problematic is the Turing test was also trying to kind of measure a kind of human equivalent type intelligence, which is also not fair to a lot of the members in the animal kingdom, because chimpanzees, for example, are superior to humans in some skills. For example, their memorization abilities vastly exceed our own. Tests show that they're not just a little bit better than us on memory tasks, they're actually considerably better than us at those sorts of tasks. And also we know that dolphins can do things better than us, both cognitively and of course physically and so on, because it's also what kind of conscious experience are you having? Like, what kind of a conscious experience do you have when your acoustic spectrum is as wide as a dolphin's? Or if or elephants can hear subsonic frequencies, and so on and so forth. So trying to circumscribe intelligence within human capacities is very limiting and very unfair. And it's another a problem inherent in having a very simplistic test such as the Turing test. I guess what we're kind of concluding here, Adam, is that this is such a complicated thing. It's just so silly to kind of have this little conversation test known as the Turing test that's going to try to solve this monumental challenge with this little contest. So I stand by my headline: the Turing test is bullshit. At least in its current incarnation.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that we may be able to do something similar to what Laurie Marino is doing for the Non-Human Rights Project to help determine whether a machine is conscious.
Yeah, yes. Absolutely. It's just, we got to nail down the criteria for personhood, and then work to prove that your algorithms and your scripts and your ones and zeros or whatever thing you put together actually has the functional aspects that you claim that it has. Mm-hmm. So you're gonna, what that means in the animal world is you look at the brain, you look at fMRIs, you slice the brains and you point to the mirror neurons or other aspects, all these sorts of, like I said, you need to kind of show that the mechanics are in place to create that phenomenon that is mind and self-awareness and thinking. Because without those mechanical parts to it, you can't have that. So, like I said as well, you have to not only find. Our struggle is to try to find what those mechanical parts are in terms of our neural correlates of consciousness, so that we can start to definitively prove that we are conscious. To definitively kind of find evidence for which to show that we're conscious, because we don't, like I said, we don't have that right now.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well. Just quickly, did you hear about the DeepMind company that was sold to Google? And so Dennis Habasis, Shane Legg, and a few others were sort of involved in creating a very interesting AI that was a little bit of a combination between reinforcement learning, which is a particular kind of AI that learns through reinforcements through its environment, right? And also some form of representational deep learning. I'm sure you've heard of deep learning. And what happened is they fed this AI, which they created, a stream of pixels from a monitor, or from basically just pixelized frames of a game, like an Atari game, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Galaga, or whatever. And so the computer learns to recognize objects and recognize scores, and it learned how to actually play these games without being told how to. And it was completely emergent, in a sense, the way that it learned, without any sort of expert system, if-then Boolean logic going into it, being told what to do. So it's interesting that there is some aspects where computers can learn by themselves, completely learn by themselves, in a sense. But it's not the same as being conscious, but it does say something about general intelligence, I think.
I agree, and I think that's definitely that could be very promising on the road towards a general intelligence. And I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that we're slowly getting there. And when I hear things like that, it's very encouraging. It makes me realize, yeah, we're that's amazing. You know, we're in a way we're kind of using the things that we use to learn things to motivate ourselves, and we're applying that at the algorithmic level. And to find that it's working is very exciting and scary at the same time.
Excellent. All right. Well, yeah. If there's any concluding statements that you'd like to give to people for a take-home at the end of this interview?
No, I think I got everything out that I wanted to.
You did, yeah. Actually, I think like your last main comment was a pretty good conclusion. I just was very excited by what you said and had some things to say. So yeah, look, it's been absolutely awesome to have you here again on the show, and looking forward to doing it again. So you can actually see George Dvorsky's contributions to IO9 quite readily. There's almost like one or a few every week, right?
5 a day.
5 a day? They're working you hard. It's amazing you have these interviews.
Yeah, 5 posts a day, one feature per day, to be fair.
Right.
And the rest, the 4 can be kind of quick blog type things. But I'm a busy guy. I work about 9 to 10 hours a day.
Wow. Very efficient. Well, it's been wonderful having you here. And I'll look forward to seeing any more developments in the media about this Eugene Gooseman apocalypse. Cheers.
Absolutely.